I'd like to take this chance to further introduce you to our speaker, Scott Cooper. Scott was recently interviewed by the Ministerial Fellowship Committee and will soon begin preliminary fellowship as a UU minister. He recently served as sabbatical minister at his home church, the First Unitarian Church of Dallas. And in May, Scott completed his ministerial internship at the Unitarian Universalist Society of Sacramento. Scott graduated in 2016 with his Master of Divinity degree from Bright Divinity School. Scott and his husband Conrad share a nearly 100-year-old home in the Oak Cliff borough of Dallas with Conrad's father, Rudy. Conrad is a psychologist and his son and daughter attend college. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you for having me back. I was here a couple years ago, and it's exciting to be back, and you all greeted me warmly. Thank you. We have two readings this morning, the first being from a book called Sources of Our Faith, and it's a book of inspirational readings by Kathleen Rollins. She edited it, and she also wrote this introduction to one of the chapters, The Second Source. In a religion of deeds, not creeds, we look to the example of our spiritual ancestors and the prophets of our time for the strength and wisdom to do the right thing. Most religious traditions have their founders, their prophets, and their sages. Unitarian Universalism is no different. We revere people like Francis David, the first clergy person in the Reformation to proclaim religious tolerance, who said, "We need not think alike to love alike." We hold up Theodore Parker, whom we heard about a few minutes ago, the radical abolitionist minister, Ralph Waldo Emerson, a leader of the Transcendentalist movement, Susan B. Anthony, who fought for women's suffrage, Norbert Fabian Chapek, who defied the Nazis, and James Reeb, martyred in Selma, Alabama, in the cause for civil rights, and many more. Yet we do not lift up our own luminaries above all others, saying that only with them will truth be found. We are led to deeper wisdom and action by many outside our own faith story who have spoken to the human condition and the ethical demand to leave the world better than we found it. Those whom we call prophets include courageous leaders of direct social action, but also those who call for an inner revolution that must precede any transformation in the wider world. Many theologians have reflected on the inseparability of justice, compassion, and love in our engagement with the world. Justice without compassion can lead to legalism and brutality. Loving without a commitment to justice can become mere sentimentality. The powers and structures of evil surround us. Many religious doctrines try to define and explain them. But we have turned away from theological disputes about evil, focusing instead on faithful encouragement to stand up and confront it.
The second reading is called Prophets by Clinton Lee Scott. Always it is easier to pay homage to prophets than to heed the direction of their vision. It is easier blindly to venerate the saints than to learn the human quality of their sainthood. It is easier to glorify the heroes of the race than to give weight to their examples. To worship the wise is much easier than to profit by their vision, their wisdom. Great leaders are honored not by adulation, but by sharing their insights and values. Grandchildren of those who stoned the prophet sometimes gather up the stones to build the prophet's monument. It is easier to pay homage to prophets than to heed the direction of their vision.
The Time Tunnel, a presentation about time and profits. It sounds like a project management PowerPoint seminar for mid-level managers. But it's not. But it promises to be just as fascinating. I'm not talking about the return on investment kind of profit, P-R-O-F-I-T. I'm talking about profit, P-R-O-P-H-E-T. You may think of profit as one of those antique biblical terms of ambiguous definition and little relevance. I say ambiguous definition because every place I looked defined profit differently, sometimes very differently. Would most people even know what to do if they were told to be prophetic? A prophet is often described as a person who serves as a channel of communication between the human and divine worlds. I was recently lucky enough to experience a production of both parts of the play, Angels in America by Tony Kushner. The first half ends with the main character being visited by an angel who proclaims him to be a prophet and tells him that the great work has begun. In the second half, he in fact travels to heaven to communicate with a host of angels. Another source describes a prophet as a person who speaks for God or a deity. Prophets have often been regarded as predictors of the future and moral and ethical innovators. But prophets were usually more intent on forthtelling, speaking to present circumstances, than to foretelling, speaking to future ones. So after reading various essays and upon reflection, I came up with 3 common denominators of those considered to be prophets, all through time from the Hebrew Bible down through the last century to today. And I recognize the irony that I keep coming up with lists of 3 for Unitarian sermons. Here's my list of 3 qualities of a prophet. A, they speak truth to power. B, they speak up for the oppressed. And C, they have moral authority. I attended an interfaith breakfast a while back. You get to meet really cool people and there's free food. A rabbi sitting next to me commented how she had been recently surprised opening the Hebrew Bible and reading how the writings of the Hebrew prophets from centuries ago sounded so current. Prophets speaking out against corrupt power structures and standing up for the oppressed. My first semester of seminary, I took a Hebrew Bible class. I had trouble keeping straight the chronological order of the events we discussed. And it didn't help that I always had to stop and remember that the bigger number years happened prior to the smaller number years. 1900 BCE takes place before 1700 BCE. So I'm very visual, and I asked the professor for a written timeline. He was hesitant to do so. He explained that ancient civilizations, their metaphor of time was more cyclical, not linear as ours is. So here's another set of 3. Roman ways of thinking about time. Roman numeral number 1, the cyclical metaphor of time. Ancient peoples were astonishingly observant and precise at recording the cycles of the seasons and the stars and the planets. Scientists believed that was because they weren't staring at their smartphones. Things that happened this time last month or this time last year in the sky or the trees or with the weather could often be observed happening again. So, my professor explained, looking at a cyclical metaphor with a linear mindset makes it easy to misinterpret their writings and intentions. For instance, mistakenly extrapolating from the writings that the earth is 6,000 years old. Not that anyone would make that mistake. This makes it interesting that the rabbi sitting next to me at that breakfast saw current meaning in the writings of the prophets centuries ago. The words of the Hebrew prophets can be useful and inspirational today because, sadly, some circumstances closely mirror those times. But the Hebrew people didn't think of time as strictly a cycle. They had the book of Genesis describing a beginning, and later Christians added to these creation myths a second coming of Jesus to mark the end of time here on earth. Hence the linear concept, Roman numeral number 2, a linear metaphor of time that we're more used to these days. Now, the geometry students among you will know that 2 points determine a line. And many people have believed that later points on the timeline would be more just and more righteous than earlier points, that humanity would inevitably and irreversibly progress. Religious liberals, more than 100 years ago, believed that humanity was just going to keep on getting better and better, more moral, more generous, more just. But then, the world wars were undeniable evidence that people could be as cruel, hateful, and yes, as evil as ever. We hadn't progressed as far as we'd imagined or hoped. By the end of the wars, only the most optimistic and prophetic seemed to believe that the timeline and moral arc were indeed bending toward justice. Perhaps if we could go back in time and prevent those wars. I remember when I was a kid, a TV show called The Time Tunnel. Now, I don't remember much about it except it came on either after Batman or the Green Hornet. And of course, people on the show were able to go back in time. So what would you do if you were able to go back in time? Would you invest in Apple and Microsoft as they were just getting started? Or maybe tell Lincoln to avoid live theater? If we went back in time, we could, as the popular phrase goes, stand on the right side of history. We could march against the redcoats, march with the suffragettes, or march at Selma. We wouldn't have to wonder and trust our gut if we were doing the right thing. We would already know who had been proven honorable. Sometimes we assume more people were on the right side of history than actually were. Always it is easier to pay homage to prophets than to heed the direction of their vision. They weren't able to go back in time down the time tunnel knowing how things would turn out. Grandchildren of those who stoned the prophet sometimes gather up the stones to build the prophet's monument. By 1967, the focus of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was on poverty, which led to his organizing the Poor People's Campaign, a plan to bring together poor people of all races from across the country for a new march on Washington. This march was to demand better jobs, better homes, better education, better lives than the ones they were living. Many are shocked to learn that during the civil rights struggles, only 13% of even black churches supported Dr. King. Many churches feared or were otherwise intimidated from showing support of his movement. A little over 100 years prior to that, in September 1850, the U.S. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Law. It was mentioned earlier. The law not only provided for the return of fugitive slaves to their masters in the South, but also required private citizens in the North to assist in their capture. Abolitionists in Boston immediately began organizing resistance to the law. Unitarian minister Theodore Parker was one of the founders of a vigilance committee, which included blacks as well as whites, and was designed to protect, quote, the colored inhabitants of Boston from any invasion of their rights, end quote. Parker wrote an angry letter to President Fillmore, and he made it clear that he would obey the laws of God, even if it meant breaking the laws of men. Now, believe it or not, Millard Fillmore, the president who had signed the Fugitive Slave Law, was also a Unitarian who hated slavery. You can't make up UU history, I'm just telling you. But he believed upholding the law for the time being was the only way to keep the Union together. He had sworn to uphold the Constitution of the United States and he had promised to abide by the decisions of the Congress. So they had passed the law. He threw the weight of his influence onto enforcing the fugitive slave law because he believed that safeguarding the Union was his sworn duty as president. Now, by my definition, both Theodore Parker and Martin Luther King Jr. were prophets. A, they spoke truth to power. B, they spoke up to the oppressed. And C, they had moral authority. Indeed, the second of the UU sources of our living tradition is Words and Deeds of Prophetic Women and Men, which challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. And as it turned out, those prophetic women and men spoke not only for their own time, but for times to come. If you have ever wondered what you would do in the past via a trip down the time tunnel, when people needed to speak truth to power and people needed to stand up for the oppressed, don't worry, look around. You have another chance. After thinking about this whole circular, linear time tunnel thing for a while, an idea occurred to me. You've been waiting for Roman numeral number 3, I know. It seemed logical to use a metaphor that acknowledges we seem to repeat patterns in history, but things aren't entirely circular. While we do repeat patterns and find ourselves responding to the same problems, they're not the exact same experiences. Let me give you an example. Peasants in biblical times found themselves combating something referred to as debt bondage. Paying less than a living wage is not a new innovation. The frequent pressing need for credit because of low wages made them constantly depend on creditors. Peasants found it impossible to get out of debt with the upper class. And the story has continued down through history. In the early part of this country's history, employees, little more than slaves to mining and railroad companies, were in perpetual debt to the company store, who charged the laborers far more than they made. Today, payday loan stores are prevalent in strip malls and low-income neighborhoods and charge exorbitant interest to those who can least afford it. And of course, going to school to get a better education and job isn't entirely the answer. The average student loan debt for the class of 2016 was $37,172, up 6% from the previous year. Americans owe over $1.48 trillion with a T dollars in student loan debt, about 620 billion with a B dollars more than the total U.S. credit card debt. Powerful people still take advantage of the oppressed and those with fewer options. But it's not entirely circular. We are, in some sense, traveling from one end of a line to the other as well. The linear metaphor, Roman numeral number 2, and I do believe that as slow as it may be, we are getting better. The arc is bending towards justice. We are moving upward as well as forward. I put all this together and came up with a new metaphor, Roman numeral number 3. It's a slinky. You see, things do go around, but they're not exactly on the same level. And sometimes things are close together. We're not making all that much progress. But sometimes they're wider apart, and we're making a lot of progress. But there's still a beginning, and there's still an end. And look, we stretch this out. Look how it's bending towards justice, slowly but surely over a long amount of time. So, we've combined those two metaphors. We have a beginning and an end, but it's circular. And we're going back around. And the really cool thing is looking down onto it You can look down and learn from the people who have done similar things in the past. That's why it's a spiral and not a circle. We can heed the words from prophets down through history, as the rabbi observed. We are here rounding the bend, looking upon prophets of yesteryear to gather wisdom and strength. Just a year before his assassination in May 1967, Dr. King said, "I think it is necessary for us to realize that we have moved from the era of civil rights to the era of human rights, when we see that there must be a radical redistribution of economic and political power. Then we see that for the last 12 years we have been in a reform movement, that after Selma and the Voting Rights Bill, we moved into a new era, which must be an era of revolution. In short, we have moved into an era where we are called upon to raise certain basic questions about the whole society." Reverend Dr. William J. Barber, creator of Moral Mondays, which you may have heard about, is currently revitalizing Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign from 50 years ago. He was able to look down that spiral and learn from and be inspired by those who came before. The Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, seeks to unite tens of thousands of people across the country to challenge the evils of systemic racism, poverty, the war economy, ecological devastation, and the nation's distorted morality. In just a few weeks, on Sunday, May 13th, the Poor People's Campaign will launch its 40 days of nonviolent direct action. I encourage you to Google Poor People's Campaign or look for Repairers of the Breach on Facebook to become involved. Now, perhaps one of the most quoted lines from a Hebrew prophet is this one from Micah. "And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God?" I realized while finishing this sermon that this famous line tracks to my A, B, and C, the three descriptors of prophets. It's an 8th century prophet version of a 21st century UU description. Do justice, speak truth to power. Love kindness, stand up for the oppressed. Walk humbly with your God. Live into your moral authority. Now, I realize this last one may give people here pause. Do we have moral authority? During the last several decades, the religious right has co-opted moral language in our political and cultural discourse. We must take it back. The first thing you heard in this morning's service was Lauren reminding us that here at Westside, compassion leads us to work for justice and equality. When we are, in fact, spurred to action out of our compassion to work for justice and equality, we are among the ones with moral authority. And here's where the unnerving part of the time tunnel slinky comes in. People further up the time tunnel slinky will one day look down on us, at you, at the prophetic members of Westside in 2018, and claim their moral authority, speak truth to power, and stand up for the oppressed, spurred by our decisions to do those very same things, here and now. Be prophetic. Those watching us from any direction of the time tunnel will see us doing the right thing. The time is very clearly now. Amen, and so be it. Please stand as you are able for the closing hymn, number 359, When We Are Gathered.